Welcome back. You're watching SABC News. This is a special broadcast. We are bringing you the funeral of Pope Francis. All eyes on the Vatican at this particular moment, as thousands of mourners, including more than hundreds delegations from various states and over 50 heads of state, have descended on the Vatican City to bid farewell to the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis. To reflect a bit on this, 6 days ago, Pope Francis appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to give his Easter Sunday blessing. Thousands of people had gathered in the square to witness the Pope's first major public appearance since his discharge from hospital, just hours after his appearance early on Easter Monday. Pope Francis died of a stroke and heart failure at his Vatican residence. So to reflect on the funeral, I'm joined now by Reverend Frank Chikane, who is the former South African Council of Churches General Secretary, Vice President of the South African Catholic Bishops' Conference, as well as Sheila Perez from the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference. Sheila Perez will join us, of course, as part of the conversation. But also we have Pauline Penny, who is the head of Ethos at St. Dominic's Catholic School for Girls. So good afternoon to all of you, my guests. Let me start with you, Pauline, just your reflections. I don't know how much of the funeral service you were able to catch from when it was happening at St. Peter's Square, outside there in the outdoors, with thousands and thousands of people that are there, the clergy, the dignitaries, and I was saying earlier on, the weather as well over the Vatican, just coming out, the music reverberating. What did you make of it all? How did it resonate with you?
I think it was absolutely beautiful. That's what Pope Francis loved. He loved being with the crowds, with the people. I remember when he was still alive, anytime he would come down to the Synod Hall and he was to meet with people, that you would see how radiant he would become because he was surrounded by the crowds, by the people. And so it was absolutely beautiful. I was at Mass. We had a Mass starting at 10 as well, presided over by the Apostolic Nuncio, who is actually the papal representative to South Africa. So I was at Mass when the funeral Mass started, but I was able to see as the car left the Vatican, as Pope Francis' body left the Vatican for the last time, passing the Vatican Gardens and eventually going under the bridge and into the streets of Rome. It was absolutely beautiful to see how people came out in their numbers to greet him.
And you mentioned people coming out in their numbers, and that's been one of the staggering, components and factors in all of this. Earlier on, I was reflecting that in terms of the order of seating and priority, naturally, the Vatican, the Holy See had to prioritize and say, I believe it was royalty, then presidents and heads of state, followed by political leaders and others. But it didn't stop no less than 250,000 people trying to be as close as possible to St. Peter's Square. Why is that? Why is it that, even before today, you had no less than 250,000 people as well coming through to have that moment to walk past as he laid in state?
As our Cardinal Stephen Brislin said in his homily on Wednesday during the Memorial Mass, is that Pope Francis didn't belong to the Catholic Church only. He belonged to the world. He was a Pope for all of us. And I think that resonated with the numbers that you've just mentioned of people that came out. That's because he loved the world, and these past days the world has shown that the world also loves the Pope. He is a people's Pope. He is the Pope that has been very close to those on the margins, to those that have felt left out. And so many people throughout the world really felt welcomed by Pope Francis.
So as I was trying to think through, how do you capture such a moment? Because there's a clear sense of us living through a moment in history. It's interesting, I used exactly those words. I said, from Argentina to the world, via the Vatican, from St. Peter's Basilica to the Basilica of St. Mary Major. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man who would become Pope Francis, the Roman Catholic's 266th Pope, has now completed his journey in life. Let's welcome into the conversation, and we're joined now by Sheila Pires, Dr. Sheila Pires, who is part of the communications team, in fact leads the communications team for the Southern African Catholic Bishops Conference. Dr. Pires, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So it's a moment in history, and I'm just wondering what emotions you were feeling, what emotions you were going through as you were watching it all unfold in all its splendor. The splendor of the traditions that have held for centuries, infused with the simplicity and humility of who Pope Francis was. Just share with me your own reflections of the funeral service that we have seen this afternoon. All right. I believe there's a bit of a confusion. Let me go through. Actually, I want to talk to Pauline Penny. Pauline, my apologies. Just your reflections as you were watching it all unfold. What did you make of what you saw, its meaning in history and in the life of Catholics and Christians around the world?
I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful ceremony and a fitting tribute to an incredible man who has not been only a pope for the Catholics in our community and our global community, but also for the whole of the country and the world in a global sense. It was very, very moving. All the beautiful prayers and the music were just astoundingly good. I think it was really a fitting tribute to a great man.
Yeah, and we're also joined by Reverend Frank Chikane. Reverend, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as well in this conversation. Just your own reflections as well, what it means not just to Catholics, but also Christians around the world. What did we witness today? My sense is it's unmistakable that we lived through a moment in history.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, and good afternoon to your listeners and those who are viewing this. I must say that, I stayed through to be part of the service. You felt like you were in the Vatican, present there. And today we've lost a pope who really was the people's pope. And you could see the excitement, the way people were sending him off in a special way. The service was fantastic, the arrangements, just the trip to where he's going to be buried, which was witnessed by people who were not in there. And that shows that he was indeed a people's pope. But I would like to say that for me, the message that became clear, especially in the presence of all the leaders who were sitting there, is that the poor matter, and that we cannot run the world as if God's people don't matter. Mm-hmm. And what this Pope did was to bring the people at the center of it. And up to his last breath, it was his commitment for the people. And that's what really, for me, struck me as he spoke. When they said, peace be with you, and they had to greet each other. it was quite extraordinary to see those leaders, even those who don't look like each other, are doing peace be with you. And that had much more meaning than it has ever had for me as it happened. Yeah.
Sheila Pires, just take us through the background in terms of what unfolded before our eyes. How close is it, how closely does it resemble the send-off of an ordinary person within the Roman Catholic Church? How much of it were people able to identify with, and how much of it had to do with his stature as the leader of the church?
I think we first look at Pope Francis' coffin, the coffin that he chose. He was a very simple man, and he said, I just want a simple wooden coffin, nothing fancy. And also the choice, the fact that he chose to be buried at St. Mary Major. As a Catholic, we are taught to have this devotion towards Our Lady. And Pope Francis emphasized that with by his own devotion to Our Lady, and now being buried at St. Maria Major Basilica. It's a place where we have been there a couple of times to pray for peace. So looking at today's service and also the inclusion of the Eastern Rite, that goes again to show you how Pope Francis wanted us all as Catholics to be united. We have so many rites in the Catholic Church, but since the Synod on Synodality, where I come to be introduced to all these different rites and actually witness and live how the services are done, one can say that Pope Francis was really an ecumenical man, an ecumenical pope, one that wants to bring all of us under one umbrella. Because at the end of the world, at the day, we are all serving one God. And that's what you saw there at St. Peter's Square.
Yeah.
People coming from all walks of life, from all religions, gathered together to pay tribute to this amazing man.
Yeah, and there was a significance, if I stick with you, there was a significance in the vestments that were worn by the cardinals that were there as part of the process. They were wearing red. Would they have been wearing a different color?
I wouldn't think so. I think that would be the appropriate color of the day. Looking at the images there, I mean, usually our cardinals, that's how they would wear on such an occasion. And also looking at those representing the Eastern churches as well. So I think that was the liturgical color chosen specifically for this day. I mean, we are talking about the burial of a pope, the leader of the church.
Yeah. Pauline Penny, let me bring you back into this conversation. What did the Pope mean to you personally as a believer?
Well, as a leader of our Catholic Church, he was obviously very, very highly regarded. And having been Pope and having seen him become Pope for the last 12 years, since 2013, one learns to know how he is by his actions and by his prayers and the things that he wrote and the things that he said and the things that he did. So I'm very, very glad that I have been able to live through his pontificate. I feel very proud to be a Catholic and to be able to have been part of his pontificate, because it has been an honor to be led by him as a shepherd of the people and a man of peace, and a man of peace for the whole world, and not just for Catholics, but for everyone in the world, and Catholics and non-Catholics.
And I imagine that you've been to the Vatican, right? As you were seeing those scenes unfolding, have you been to the Vatican before?
I haven't had the chance to go, but it is on my bucket list. I will go eventually.
Yeah. Reverend Frank Chikane, just also the opportunity, you were talking about the message that says God's people matter. And I think it was my colleague Sophie Mkwena who was saying a few minutes ago that the way that the service unfolded, the message that was being shared, the space that it provided for various world leaders, we're told there were no less than 50 heads of state and no less than 10 sitting monarchs. In terms of that, and just being in that space and the message that was being shared, what do you imagine it would have done in a world that is so troubled? I mean, we're seeing in the last few minutes images that have come through of Donald Trump meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the funeral. But beyond just those two that situation in Ukraine and those two leaders, what would it have meant for the other leaders that are gathered there?
Well, that's why I started from there. Mm-hmm. The point is the Pope took the world as his parish. You know when you take the world as your parish and worry about everything that's happening around the world. I mean, I was the moderator of the Church's Commission on International Affairs of the WCC, and we had a representative of the Catholic Church there. And when the war broke out, we were dealing with that crisis of Ukraine, Russia. And I'm one person who is convinced and was convinced then that war should never have happened, could have been avoided. But the political leaders had other interests other than peace. and they pursued those interests at the expense of the lives of the people of Ukraine. And that's tragic. And the Pope has spoken from the beginning about this matter. And I could talk about others. I mean, he used to be in contact with Gaza and spoke about them as part of his parish. And I'm told he used to call them daily. I mean, the hospitals were destroyed. You know, the Catholic Church has got facilities, schools, hospitals, and various other churches as well. And they were destroyed, and people were being killed there. And people expected him to keep quiet, like other leaders are keeping quiet about this. And that's where I really got to know that this Pope is a servant of God who cares about the people.
Yeah.
But I must tell you something else, because I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. I'm just a good Pentecostal.
Yes.
But I've worked with Catholics in my life, Albert Nolan and others. We produced the Kairos document, and the Jesuits, in which order the Pope comes from, hosted me in their house when I was in underground, and in their place, their facilities during the struggle. And I used to be moved from one place to another. And I even shared worship and everything. You can't stay 3 months underground in a Jesuit center. And they took me as part of them, part of their brother, and made sure I was safe. And so I have a very close relationship with the Catholic Church. In the Institute for Contextual Theology, we worked on theology together. I went to Latin America, met with the Association of Third World Theologians. And so I have a history about that and an experience. And this Pope was the advanced level of what I know at the highest level. I mean, I've been dealing with Catholics at a lower level, but this was an expression of what justice should be at the highest level of the Catholic Church. And that's what I appreciated.
Yeah. So as you mentioned that, Reverend Chikane, the instructions were quite clear about him wanting to be buried at St. Mary Major Basilica in that testament that was then unsealed and publicized. Let me just quote from it. He said, "I ask that my tomb be prepared in the burial niche in the side aisle between the Pauline Chapel and the Stoza Chapel of the Basilica as shown in the attached plan." So there was even a plan that was attached to it. Reverend Chikane mentions that he was of the order of the Jesuits. Please share with us, Dr. Sheila Perez, what that means and the significance of the St. Mary Major Basilica, particularly for this order, but also for Pope Francis himself.
Yes, so Pope Francis comes from the Jesuit order in Argentina. So he was the very first Jesuit Pope that we've had, the very first Argentine Pope that we've had. And if you see the Jesuit order in the church, for example, we see the Jesuit priests as a priest that are very, I don't want to use the word radical, but they're really not afraid to say things as they are. They're priests who go out there and look at issues related to justice, for example, issues related to climate change. I'm not saying that the other orders don't, but the Jesuits are very well known for this. And so Pope Francis comes from that background whereby, if things are not going wrong, we're going to speak up, we're going to be active. As Reverend Frank Chikane said, it was the Jesuits who assisted him, as well as the Dominican priests. You mentioned Father Albert Nolan. And so these are religious orders that have always been at the forefront of fighting for issues related for justice for all. And this is what Pope Francis resembles. At the same time, we look at humility, we look at devotion to Our Lady, as I mentioned. The Basilica of Our Lady Santa Maria Maggiore is one place where Pope Francis would always pass by before he traveled to go anywhere outside Rome. And even when he came back, it was always a place where he would come and say Thanksgiving. So that was his primarily home. And at the same time, remember that Pope Francis always called himself the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah.
And hence, being buried at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, where it's the Italians themselves, those in Rome, have a very strong devotion to as well.
Yeah, wow, incredible. Pauline, let me bring you back into the conversation once again. Tell me about what it was a funeral, but almost in a manner that's almost, in a way, perhaps in the spirit that it encapsulated, comparable to a certain degree to what happened when former President Nelson Mandela passed on, in that it ended up being a celebration of the person's life, a celebration of the person's values and what they stood for. What are your hopes for what this being a funeral and many, many South Africans, Christians and non-Christians, Catholic and non-Catholic, witnessing it and seeing and hearing all of these testaments about what Pope Francis stood for and what he represented? What do you hope that will do to the body of the church in South Africa?
I really do hope that people will be touched by the Holy Spirit, which was obviously evident during that whole funeral requiem mass today. It was very, very evident that the Holy Spirit was there and strong and being right through the whole process. And we hope that the people will be touched by this and they will see the importance of a funeral where the repose of the soul of the deceased is prayed for and their life is celebrated and their actions are recognized throughout the whole world. So I really do hope that for everybody there and everybody watching, it would be a significant experience for everyone.
Yeah.
And they would see how important the Pope was to the whole world and how these things like Requiem Masses can have a major effect on the whole world through the power of the Holy Spirit.
Reverend Chikane, same question to you as well. There's been at various points commentary that says, quote unquote, religion is on the decline. It tended to sort of dominate quite a bit in the years immediately after the pandemic and the lockdowns and that disruption that brought. But when you have historic moments such as these and that are communicated widely, and the production was flawless, in terms of just sharing it with the rest of the world. It was absolutely flawless. And the histories and the traditions are on full display to a global audience. What do you believe that does to the body of the church in the world, but also in South Africa?
Oh, well, I must start from my church, that we are a missional church. That's why we called Apostolic Faith Mission. When I watched it, I said, this is a missional experience because it's going to touch many people. Just watching, there are millions of people who have watched it, listening to the messages, listening to who Pope Francis was, what he was doing. Even those who are losing the faith will regain the faith because there's too much negativity about the church in the world. And in some tradition, even support oppressive regimes and brutality that's committed by dictators. And when people hear the voice of Pope Francis, it tells you that God is not what people say God is. I think that to me was a very clear message. That's why I started from the leaders who are sitting there, who start wars that are completely unnecessary, and the people who die are not the leaders, it's the people on the ground. And I think Pope Francis' message, his funeral itself had a message on its own.
Yeah.
To all the people of the world, not just for Catholics, but for everybody. I happen to be very ecumenical, so I work with everybody.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the Catholic Church's contribution I also have had an opportunity when I was General Secretary to visit the Vatican and interact with the Pope then when I was General Secretary. So I appreciate what the Catholics are doing and what Pope Francis does. I mean, his life testifies to what God is about and what the church should be about.
Yeah. Same question to you, Dr. Sheila Perez, your own reflections on the extent to which this will be a moment of revival for some.
Yes, I was listening to you talking about the COVID-19 period, for example, and it reminded me of the day that Pope Francis was alone at St. Peter's Square, during the lockdown, and there he was praying for the whole world by himself. However, he was alone at St. Peter's Square, but the whole world was with him through these digital means. And one thing that we highlighted a lot during the Synod on Synodality, which was instituted by Pope Francis, is that in a synodal church we have to embrace digitalization. And so we've become digital missionaries at the same time. We've become a more missionary church. And in a synodal church, we are called to be missionaries of the gospel. And so this is what comes to mind when I look at how today unfolded, how the whole world got to witness this beautiful moment, that we have really gone from being an isolated church inside a church building, but to go out into the world and really become more missionary as called for by Pope Francis.
So as we part ways, let me end off with you, Dr. Sheila Perez. Now that we've witnessed the service and the funeral has come and gone, my understanding is that the church, the leadership, everyone gets into a period of mourning. Tell me how that unfolds leading up to the conversation, the necessary conversation about the leadership of the global church.
That's right. Starting off today, we are in a period of 9 days of mourning as the cardinals prepare to go into a conclave on the 5th of May. So far, that's the date that has been announced, the 5th of May. So during this period, it's really a time to remember, or rather to celebrate Pope Francis' life, but at the same time to pray for the repose of his soul. It's a time to pray for the cardinals who will be going into conclave to elect a new pope. It's a time for us to reflect on who we are as a church, and at the same time, different churches, parishes, dioceses will be having services, special services to remember Pope Francis, just like we've been having memorial services. Yeah. As a matter of fact, there will be an ecumenical service organized by the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference together with the South African Council of Churches on the 1st of May. And this is an ecumenical service, something that Pope Francis also always wanted us to be, an ecumenical church, one that joins the other churches in praying. So yes, that's what we'll be doing during this period.
All right. I've got to thank you for your time and your generosity, sharing your insights and inside knowledge. That's Dr. Sheila Perez there. We were also joined by Pauline Penny as well as Reverend Frank Chikane, just reflecting on what we have seen over the last few hours, playing itself out with the focus being at the Vatican. So let's continue then. Behind the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel, an ancient tradition will begin, as Sheila Perez was just telling us a few moments ago. It's called the conclave, but that's only coming up after the 9 days of mourning. It is a solemn and highly secretive gathering where eligible cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church come together to choose the next leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Only those under the age of 80 are allowed to vote, and the decision must come from within their own ranks. A 2/3 majority needed to elect the next pope. Now, with the pope laid to rest, the world turns its focus to what happens next. Who will rise to lead the church, and how is a new pope chosen? Former Vatican correspondent Philip Pulela explains.
The conclave essentially is a closed-door meeting in which Roman Catholic cardinals who are under the age of 80 elect the new pope from among their own numbers, okay? In order to get into a conclave, you have to be a cardinal. In order to get into a conclave, you have to be under 80 years old. and from one of those people inside that room in the Sistine Chapel, they will elect the Pope with a 2/3 majority. What happens inside is that each of the cardinals writes on a slip of paper which says in Latin something along the lines, "I choose as Pope so-and-so." They write it down in their own handwriting, and they are encouraged to masquerade their handwriting. Then these votes are counted, and if there are enough, a new Pope has been elected. If there are not enough, they go to another vote.